Welcome to everyone to the last of our 8-part Crossing Border series on people leaving Mexico and in some cases Central America, crossing borders and building new lives and communities in the United States. I'm John Tutino. I am a professor of history at Georgetown and have the pleasure of overseeing the program we call the Americas Forum, which has organized this event in collaboration with the new Georgetown Americas Institute. This, as I said, is our last session. And the title of it is Carrying New York City Through COVID-19. And I will say this is the most contemporary of our sessions. It really brings us to the most recent challenges of border crossing. So I am going to, in fact, do an introduction, but I am going to delegate the moderator role to Marcella Harden, who I will quickly demonstrate to you is far more prepared than I am to moderate this session. Marcella is a graduate of the University of Oregon. Over several years, she has worked to provide services to victims of sex trafficking in Puebla, in southern Mexico. She has worked to help provide legal services to Mexican and Guatemalan immigrants in rural Oregon. And she has worked to provide nutritional services to MAM, Guatemalan immigrants in Oregon. She's now well along in her doctoral studies in history at Georgetown, is formally a doctoral candidate, and I am pleased to announce has recently won a Fulbright Award to move forward on her dissertation research, which will study migration from, and mostly indigenous migration, from Guatemala through Mexico to the United States in recent decades. I want to do a brief introduction of our presenter today. Marcella will perhaps have more to say. But Marta Guerrero, originally from Mexico, came to Georgetown as an undergraduate, where she's a student of culture and politics. And while in the culture and politics program, proceeded to write an undergraduate thesis that won the award as the best thesis in history of Latin America at Georgetown. She recently completed an MS at journalism at Columbia University. And it was in that activity that she did the amazing research that's at the base of what she's doing today. She did one-on-one interviewing week after week with Mexican and Central American indigenous immigrants, mostly bicycle deliverers, house cleaners, and published, all I will say is endless insightful reporting in the bilingual news site Informe Confidencial. Um, and now, just looking forward, she's en route to the PhD program in history at Yale. So with that, I am going to step back to leave this conversation to two young women far more prepared than I to do this in depth and detail. So Marcella, to you.
Thank you, Professor Tutino, for the great introduction. And thank you, everybody, for coming to the last talk in the Crossing Border series. As Professor Tutino said, today I have the honor of speaking with Marta Guerrero about her reporting of 2 migrant-led worker mobilizations in New York City during the COVID-19 pandemic. And given the recent upsurge in labor mobilizations across the nation right now, I think this will be a really timely conversation and of interest to a lot of people. So with that being said, we have the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and you can go ahead and enter your questions throughout the presentation, and then we'll get to them later on during the talk. But yeah, go ahead and enter those throughout the session, and we'll go ahead and answer them at the end. But yeah, Marta, I'm really excited to get to talk to you about this and this particular moment where immigrant rights and labor rights converged. Yeah, with that, I will go ahead and pass it on to you. I am hoping that this will be the first conversation of many between us.
Thank you so much for that. Those absolutely wonderful introductions that I will try to live up to. I'm very thankful to Professor Tutino, especially for inviting me to be a part of the Crossing Borders series, as well as to George Challenge Forum and Americas Institute for hosting these talks. And so if Marcella, you could share my PowerPoint, please, I'll get started and try to do this as quickly as I can. So as scholars before me have explored Mexican migrations to the US through much of the 20th century, as Marcella mentioned, my goal today is to broaden the scope a little bit and close off this series by looking ahead straight into the 21st century. And so today I will essentially talk about my research on two different migrant-led labor movements in New York City during the COVID pandemic. And so, as Professor Tutino mentioned, this research essentially resulted from around a year's worth of on-the-ground reporting that I conducted as a master's student at Columbia University's School of Journalism throughout 2021. So if we could move over to our first slide. So I'm going to talk about two different stories. And the first story is that of the Libreristas Unidos, a grassroots collective created by mostly indigenous Central American and Mexican app-based delivery workers who successfully organized last year for local legislation regulating New York City's tech delivery industry. And so if we could move over to the next slide, the second story that I'm going to talk about is the Excluded Workers Coalition, which was a multinational migrant-led group that successfully lobbied for a $2.1 billion pandemic relief fund for undocumented workers. And so New York passed this fund after a 23-day hunger strike performed by migrant workers. So these two labor-centered campaigns developed during the COVID health emergency, which was a period that both visibilized New York's growing reliance on migrant labor, as well as the utter precarity faced by urban undocumented communities. And so if we could move to the next slide to start us off, I think it's useful to have a rough timeline in mind, which essentially let us know that by the summer of 2020, as you can see here, both the Libreristas Unidos and the Excluded Workers Coalition had already begun to organize. And so in September 2021, the Libreristas Unidos had successfully promoted the passage of New York City Council legislation regulating delivery app companies at the local level. And a few months earlier, in April 2021, the Excluded Workers Coalition had secured $2.1 billion in the New York State budget to relieve undocumented workers after the pandemic. And so we could move over to our next slide. Now that we have a little bit of a general picture, I'm going to begin with the story of the Libreristas Unidos, which will essentially immerse us into the world of delivery apps, which, as many of us know, have become a prevalent means of ordering food, mainly across urban and suburban areas, and whose use was definitely exacerbated during the pandemic. And so the story of the Libreristas Unidos is also one of a racialized workforce made up mostly of indigenous migrants from Central America and Mexico. So if we could move over to our next slide. Okay, so in order to situate the origins and evolution of the Libreristas Unidos, it's important to first take a look at how tech delivery companies generally function, as well as the effects that the pandemic had on the e-food delivery industry. And so to get a little bit more of a broader picture, over the last decade, food delivery through third-party apps such as DoorDash, Uber Eats, Grubhub, and Relay, you can see some of the logos here, turned into a fast-growing tech industry with a US market projected to hit over 30 billion this year and a global market that has tripled since 2017, reaching 150 billion. And so as I scrutinized the world of delivery apps for my reporting at Columbia, it became clear that I was researching a relatively new industry whose success was primordially rooted in cheap, expendable labor. And so despite generally working full-time, drivers receiving low and unreliable wages were hired as independent contractors, or more popularly known as gig workers, who were essentially entitled to no employee benefits. We could move over to our next slide. We are going to see that as delivery apps became a lifeline for a struggling restaurant industry during the pandemic, online meal delivery sales essentially skyrocketed. And so the US delivery market grew nearly 50% within the first couple of months of 2020. And by the end of that year, DoorDash had joined Uber Eats in becoming a public company, reaching a $60 billion valuation, $60 billion dollar valuation, sorry about that. And so as New York City's unemployment rate rose over to 13% in 2020, migrant workers who were formerly employed across the food service sector, which was hard hit by COVID, flocked to booming delivery apps. And so Uber Eats alone hired 30,000 new bike couriers in March and April of 2020. And if we could move over to our next slide, we're going to see that New York's delivery app workforce rose to an estimated 65,000. And so this was a workforce made up mostly of low-wage male immigrants from Mexico, Central America, China, and South Asian and West African nations. And so if we could move over to our next slide. Even as New York's growing reliance on delivery apps turned bike couriers into essential workers during the pandemic, their working conditions, which were already precarious enough, rapidly deteriorated. So we could move over to our next slide. I'm going to introduce a main player in the story whose name is Gustavo Arce. And so I used to have a human boss. Now it feels like I'm working for a ghost on my phone, said Gustavo Arce, a 39-year-old Quiche indigenous man from Totonicapán, Guatemala, that I encountered in early 2021. With the pandemic, the ghost started acting even more heartless than before, he said. It's like they figured out that we needed the job too much to complain, and that even if we complained, no one would listen. So after migrating to New York City in 2004 and over a decade working in restaurants and construction sites, Gustavo Arce became a bike courier for delivery tech companies in 2018, bringing DoorDash, Uber Eats, and Relay food orders to customers at the height of the pandemic. And so we could move over to our next slide. Even as food delivery companies saw their sales jump at historic rates, workers' pay remained low and erratic. So most apps don't pay per hour, they pay per delivery. And so biking over 50 hours a week in 2020, Gustavo Arce rarely broke over $500 a week, amounting to around $10 an hour, which, as we know, falls well below New York's $15 minimum wage. We could move over to our next slide. According to a 2021 study by the Worker Institute at Cornell University School of Industrial and Labor Relations, net earnings for New York delivery workers were averaging $7.87 per hour in the middle of the pandemic, with fluctuating tips representing up to 45% of total pay. So previously, a 2019 New York Times investigation had revealed that DoorDash and other apps often subsidize drivers' wages with customers' tips, which effectively was committing wage theft. We're used to having the apps give us different tips than the clients, recounted Sammy Escalante, a 24-year-old Quiche indigenous from Totonicapán, Guatemala, and a driver for DoorDash and Relay. We could move over to our next slide. This is just my promotion of Sammy Escalante's photos, who, in addition of being one of the founding members of the Libreristas Unidos, also became the official photographer of delivery workers. So you'll see a lot of the pictures of Sammy in this presentation. We could move over to the next slide. As delivery companies continually argued that fluctuating wages wasn't really an uncommon phenomenon for gig workers who were essentially just delivering part-time to earn a little extra cash, which is one of the largest sales points of delivery apps. Just work as long as you want, you're your own boss, and you get to earn a little extra cash. However, the reality on the ground, specifically New York City, looked very different from this. And so in Cornell University study, which surveyed 500 bike couriers, 85% of those referred to app-based delivery work as their only and main source of income. And so as delivery apps thrived, the pandemic really became a tipping point for many migrant bike couriers. So during the summer of 2020, Gustavo Acche joined other workers such as Jonan Huerta, who you can all see here, a 33-year-old Nahuatl indigenous courier from Mexico City, and together with around a handful of, let's say, half a dozen deliveristas who were the original founders, founded Los Deliveristas Unidos. We knew that we wanted the word deliverista in there because it's not exactly an English word, but it's not a Spanish word either, remembered Gustavo Acche during an interview. So we could move over to our next slide. While some of the deliveristas' grievances, in fact, preceded the pandemic, such as tip discrepancies and wage theft, lack of transparency across app performance ratings, and disproportionately high processing fees for payments below minimum wage, COVID also fostered new abuses. And so besides denouncing no hazard pay in case of contracting COVID on the job and no PPE to make deliveries, drivers were particularly outraged by a new lack of access to restaurant bathrooms that was exacerbated during the pandemic, as well as new ride safety issues caused by apps' increase of delivery distances and order sizes. So during the pandemic, most apps accelerated their already ongoing expansion into chain corporations. This meant chain grocery stores, pharmacies, liquor stores, pet stores, which inevitably put excessive weight on a workforce that was predominantly bikers around New York City. If we could move over to our next slide, it's really tough to balance my bike when I carry more than I should. In a city like this, with so many cars near, a veer in the wrong direction can cost me my life. This was the testimony of Manuel, a DoorDash courier from El Salvador and member of Deliveristas Unidos. Manuel showed me pictures of his heaviest deliveries, which he preferred not to make public, which is why you can't see them here, but they included 30-pound dog food bags, stacks of toilet paper, multiple bags of groceries, and large cases of wine and bottled water. So just to keep in mind, these are all items that single drivers on e-bikes or motorbikes are carrying through New York City. And so within this context, the Deliveristas Unidos evolved from what was essentially a small Facebook page informing couriers of available public restrooms and disease prevention tips into a labor group that was affiliated with Workers' Justice Project, which was a Brooklyn-based community organization and migrant work center. And so this connection emerged largely because of both Gustavo Acche's background as a local volunteer for Workers' Justice Project, as well as the overall density of Guatemalan and Mexican deliveristas living in Brooklyn and Upper Manhattan, which was, you guessed it, where Workers' Justice Project operated the most. If we could move over to our next slide. So despite not being legally allowed to organize as independent contractors, the deliveristas staged their first massive street protest in October 2020, with the support of Workers' Justice Project organizers, as well as many, many delivery workers. Over 600 bike couriers were donning flags from Guatemala, Mexico, and other nations, and biking down Manhattan's Broadway Avenue to City Hall, honking and chanting in favor of restroom access, living wages, and verified tips. We could move over to our next slide. We're stuck between companies that exploit us and aren't transparent at all, and restaurants that treat us badly sometimes. We're nobody's problem, we don't technically work for anyone, and yet everyone still relies on us showing up day in, day out. Recounted Jonan Huerta, co-founder of Deliveristas Unidos. And so here you can see some of the pictures of these demonstrations. By early 2020, Deliveristas Unidos had grown its Facebook presence and added members from Bangladesh, India, China, and West African nations. And so this drew the attention of more and more New York City Council members representing districts in Queens, Manhattan, and Brooklyn. 6 months after their first street protest, the Deliveristas Unidos gathered around 1,000 drivers in April 2021, staging the city's largest display of app delivery workers to date, which you can see here. You could move over to our next slide. So following such high turnout for the Libreristas Unidos protest in 2020 and 2021, delivery companies were quick to mobilize in New York City. And so in the summer of 2021, APP supported a state legislation proposal that sought to unionize their couriers in exchange for effectively locking in their independent contractor status. And so essentially, delivery apps were aiming to reproduce their previous success in California, where gig companies spent a record joint $225 million, marking California's California's most expensive ballot campaign in history. And they passed Proposition 22, which was essentially a ballot measure that allowed these companies to permanently classify their couriers as independent contractors. And so besides excluding gig workers from nearly all employee rights under California law, Proposition 22 also limited local government's abilities to regulate these companies. So if we could move over to our next slide. And so aware of this context, the Libreristas Unidos quickly opposed the New York bill. The Libreristas essentially denounced built-in restrictions that were within the law's language that would have prevented them from participating in most union activities, stripped them of minimum state labor protections, but most importantly, would have forever eliminated the possibility of them being reclassified as employees. And so ultimately, the Libreristas Unidos was successful in its dismantling of legislation backed by delivery companies through public statements and street protest. It's more comfortable for apps, unions, and legislators to meet behind closed doors and decide our futures. But having money and power should never mean that you can write up laws without ever talking to a single driver, said Gustavo Arce. We could move over to our next slide. And so after this development, the labor group essentially took to the streets for the rest of 2021. They hosted public rallies, bike tune-ups, and small assemblies with workers, activists, and legislators. Additionally, besides continually meeting with these same local legislators and public officials, one of the most defining components of the Libreristas Unidos campaign was to continue to gather evidence of abuses perpetrated by delivery companies. If we could move over to our next slide, you are going to see here that the Libreristas organized around a core set of 6 demands meant to be addressed by legislation at the city level. So here you can see access to restaurant bathrooms, protection against e-bike theft, limits on order sizes and delivery distances, as well as tip and wage disclosures, living wages and hazard pay, and a fair process to dispute ratings and terminations. And so catering to advocates, legislators, and consumers at large, the Libreristas Unidos pushed these demands as key measures to fight exploitations at the hand of delivery apps and at times even restaurants. And so on September 23rd, 2021, New York City Council responded by passing landmark legislation with an overwhelming majority. So you can see here, there was significant overlap between the Libreristas Unidos demands and the local laws that were passed by New York City Council, particularly as it pertained to compulsory tip and wage disclosures and the right to set delivery distance limits and avoid tunnels and bridges. And so going a little bit more deep into these two, I'm going to talk a little bit about that overlap. And so this overlap resulted from each bill containing intimate knowledge of the delivery app industry. And what was fascinating about that was that this knowledge was provided by the low-wage migrants powering this industry. The Libreristas Unidos successfully isolated key algorithmic practices that companies employed to pocket tips, cap workers' pay, and manage the Libreristas' labor in ways that made them do more work for less money. So it's important to understand, if we could move over to our next slide, that before food delivery apps came into the picture around a decade ago, most delivery workers were directly employed by restaurants, which in turn defined delivery zones to ensure that no customer had to wait too long for their food. And so it was very common for someone to know that they couldn't order from a certain restaurant because it wasn't within a certain ratio, right? And so people would order locally from their Chinese local restaurant or from their pizza place, right? And so with a growing workforce, delivery companies significantly challenged this model. And by gamifying working conditions, they found more and more ways to push drivers into accepting orders that were farther and farther away. And this may all sound very neutral, but as delivery workers provided evidence for how apps did that, we can see some interesting developments. If we could move over to our next slide. Okay, so we're going to talk about companies' evaluation systems, which, as many of you may not know, I did not know when I first started researching these companies. Evaluation systems across delivery companies largely rely on bikers' acceptance of orders, regardless of any factor. And so let's keep in mind that these are companies who are telling workers, you are your own boss, you can work whenever you want, however you want, you can pick and choose the orders that you deliver, right? But in reality, if workers rejected too many orders, they faced poor internal evaluations, which resulted in fewer or less favorable shifts to work in the future, and could ultimately end in the deactivation of their accounts. The apps use internal ratings to enforce many unwritten rules, recounted Sami Escalante during an interview. And so back to delivery apps, as two of New York's most popular delivery platforms, DoorDash and Relay became the focus of the Liberistas Unidos denunciations of algorithmic incentives and punishments that were constraining their labor, and not only their labor, but their access to work itself. So let's start with DoorDash, who you can see here, and just to contextualize, DoorDash is currently the largest supplier of e-food sales in the country, so it's the largest company within the US. So DoorDash not only evaluates workers through customers' ratings, as it's generally thought. Here you can see a couple of internal ratings that only workers are able to see. And so acceptance rates was really fascinating to me, because the San Francisco company enforced certain expectations that had less to do with customer service and more with extracting full-time employment obligations from independent contractors through this rating, right? And so DoorDash, we could move over to our next slide. DoorDash relies on due-to orders when consumption is exceptionally low. And so if you have one of those apps on your phone, different promotions will pop on your phone and you'll get notifications saying that you can get meals on $2, $5, or $10, right? And so even though due-to orders result in an average 2 wage for the Liberistas, and they often don't come in with tips because people are usually just ordering a milkshake that is in promotion or fast food that's in promotion. And so people don't tend to tip. But these orders can still take couriers several miles to complete. And so even though DoorDash was repeatedly arguing every time that I interviewed them, every time that other journalists interviewed them, that there was no minimum acceptance rate and drivers were essentially completely free to decline any number of orders without any negative consequence whatsoever, right? But the reality on the ground, again, proved to be very different. And so you have here evidence provided by workers like Acche, Huerta, and Escalante, who essentially proved that DoorDash was pausing their shifts for not accepting due-to orders. So again, let's remember that these are companies that classify workers as independent contractors because they get to pick and choose, they get to be their own bosses. It's all about flexibility, right? Except not really. And so you can see the app notification here, in which the app effectively gave drivers the choice to lose their access to work altogether or to keep laboring for $2 wages indefinitely. And so for DoorDash, just to wrap up, besides immediate obstructions, such as this one, DoorDash also pressured workers through the Top Dasher program, which you can see some of the requirements to become a Top Dasher here on the top of our screen. That program essentially rewards drivers who behave as full-time employees and discriminates those who don't. So in the slide, you can see the requirements, which essentially tell us that any non-top dasher, which means any driver that does not accept over 70% of orders, will invariably have less access to work. And so if we could go back one slide. So now that we've talked about sort of the big fish, which is DoorDash, let's talk about Relay, which is a company that mainly operates on the East Coast, mainly on New York City, and fell a little bit under the radar as people were investigating the delivery app industry because it really wasn't a big name. And also some restaurants would actually hire Uber Eats or DoorDash or a big name, but would use the delivery services exclusively of Relay. So it worked a little bit like a third-party aggregator, a delivery app for delivery apps. Okay, but let's quickly talk about smaller companies like Relay, which the Libreristas Unidos accused of tying internal ratings to access to work even more directly. And so the New York-based company essentially employs a single internal rating to evaluate its drivers at the end of their shifts, which is then pivotal for them to secure working hours the next day. And so in order to access Relay's first come, first served shift booking system, drivers had to maintain very high internal ratings, which, and you may sense a theme here, were only possible if they accepted all orders during a shift. And so demonstrating the worker provided industry knowledge that went into some of City Council's new legislation, it was precisely the new distance limit law that effectively stripped apps of their power to manipulate workers through these kinds of internal ratings. So you can see here the relationship between intimate knowledge of how apps actually work and legislation. And you have the bridge, the Libreristas Unidos. And so if we could move over to the next slide, in hopes of wrapping up and moving on to my next story. It's important to note that despite these important labor gains, ensuring better safety and more transparent compensation, the Libreristas continue to face one of the highest death rates on the job in New York City. So in the past 2 years, at least 25 migrant delivery workers were killed due to a mixture of traffic accidents and street violence. And so part of my reporting, in fact, revealed that in 2020, app couriers accounted for nearly 50% of New York City cycling fatalities, and at least 13 delivery workers died on the job last year. And so these deaths included 29-year-old Francisco Villalba, who was fatally shot in East Harlem during an attempted bike theft, and 31-year-old Salvador Navarrete Flores, who crashed into an illegally parked truck in the Upper East Side. Delivery companies continue to provide no hazard pay, and none of the recent bills passed by City Council directly addressed this issue. The fear of every Libreista is not returning home after a day's work, said Gustavo Ache. So many of us have died, and so many of us will keep dying if things don't change. We could move over to our last slide on the Libreristas. Here we can see some of the high-profile allies that the Libreristas Unidos has mobilized over the past couple of months, especially as this local victory suddenly entered in national conversation because of California and New York's contrast, right? So you had a state in which delivery companies were able to permanently classify their workers as gig workers forever, and you had New York City, which was locally regulating delivery apps. And so that was pretty much why this sort of shift occurred. And so you have here Senator Chuck Schumer, you have Representative Ocasio-Cortez, and you have New York's new mayor, Eric Adams. So hopefully I didn't rush too much through that, but now we're going to move on to the Excluded Workers Coalition. Okay, so now I'm going to walk you through my research of the Excluded Workers Fund and the multinational migrant coalition behind its passage in 2021. We could move over to our next slide. Okay, so in order to understand the origins and the evolution of the Excluded Workers Coalition, it's important to keep in mind the extent of the crisis that was faced by undocumented communities from Mexico, Ecuador, Colombia, Central America, the Dominican Republic, and Haiti, among others, during the pandemic. So already the city's lowest earners, despite high participation in the labor force, undocumented communities experienced a combination of job loss, business closures, food insecurity, homelessness, and the trauma associated with losing family or community members to COVID or getting sick themselves. And so you have to keep in mind that if this sounds familiar for a lot of people during the pandemic, these were people who were going through these combined crises without any safety network when it came to government assistance. If we could go over to our next slide. So undocumented workers remained at the front lines of the pandemic, making up over half of New York City's essential workforce in 2020. Yet they were also among the first workers to lose jobs, given their overrepresentation across customer-facing industries. And so here we have a coalition memorial of some of the undocumented community members who passed away due to COVID. But keeping in mind that within this dual crisis, up to 300,000 New Yorkers remained ineligible to collect unemployment, collect stimulus checks, or apply for small business loans because of their immigration status. So think about an undocumented street vendor who was not able to save his or her business because he was not able to access a loan. We could move over to our next slide. And so it was within this context that around 200 New York migrant-focused community organizations formed the Excluded Workers Coalition in May 2020 to demand COVID relief for undocumented workers. And so the coalition slogan, essential but excluded, sought to underline the contradictions between a group of workers that New York both relied on and ostracized, which we can also see a theme here when we think back to Beliberistas Unidos. And so through 2020 and 2021, the Excluded Workers Coalition essentially organized caravans to Albany, shut down New York City bridges, held food distribution drives, food pantries, and at one point camped out Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos' penthouse to expose the contradictions between billionaires who were upping their wealth during the pandemic and the low-wage workers servicing those corporations who were falling through the cracks. We can move over to our next slide. Okay, so as state budget negotiations in Albany began, the Fast for the Forgotten hunger strike was the coalition's most ambitious collective action to date. And so the 23-day rolling hunger strike enlisted around 85 migrant workers who took on shifts to fast across churches in Manhattan and upstate New York. Organizers reported that 96% of these strikers were in fact migrant women of color. So we could move over to our next slide. Beginning on March 16, 2021, strikers didn't break their fast until April 7th, which was a day after New York approved the nation's first multi-billion pandemic relief package for undocumented workers. And so now that we have a little bit of the big picture, I want us to zoom into the stories of three of the longest standing strikers. So if we could move over to our next slide, and then our next slide, please. And sorry, next one. Okay, so we have three people that I'm going to talk about. Rubiela Correa from Colombia, which we can see here, Ana Ramirez from Mexico, right in the middle, and Felipe Hidrobo from Ecuador. Correa and Ramirez were the longest standing strikers in the protest, going more than 550 hours without food. And Hidrobo followed them with 500 hours. We could move over to our next slide. Okay, so this is Rubiela Correa. She was a 49-year-old migrant from Colombia who came into the US a decade ago. This is a picture that she drew at the beginning of the strike. And so in late March 2020, she lost her 3 jobs as a domestic worker for 2 households and a home health aide for an elderly couple. They were afraid that I would bring them the virus because I traveled in city buses and the subway, Correa recounted. Suddenly, everyone shut the door, saying that in a couple of weeks, I could come back. But then a month, 6 months, a year went by and nothing changed. So when Correa's mother died in Colombia in early 2021, the cleaner and caregiver was unable to send flowers to her funeral because she had no money. And after losing all of her sources of income, Correa also lost the ability to support her teenage son in Colombia. So the migrant worker said that she essentially stopped being able to afford basic needs one by one, from bus fare to her high blood pressure medication and later even food. I'd go to food banks, stay hours in line, and walk back home with a small bag of lentils, rice, and cans expiring in 2 days, remembered Correa. It made me feel so small to struggle like that just to eat. And so as 4 months of rent piled up, the Colombian migrant was forced out of her Queens apartment after her landlord threatened her. Rubiela slept in shelters and at times inside JFK Airport. And so you had a situation in which, even though evictions were not common practice in New York City, landlords would often use tenants' migration status, if they knew about it, to threaten them. I'm going to call the police, I'm going to call ICE, and then you're going to be deported back home. And so despite working 70-hour weeks and paying taxes, Correa said that the pandemic bared the extreme vulnerability of her life as an undocumented immigrant. I fell into a severe depression and just wanted to pack my bags and go home, said Correa. But then I was reminded that there was nothing for me back home either. It was such a vicious cycle. Correa was not alone in her intense struggles. If we could move over to our next slide. Here is Felipe Hidrobo, a 52-year-old migrant from Ecuador who arrived in New York City during the late 1990s and joined the strike after unemployment and COVID rapidly transformed his life. The pandemic took everything I had, everything just fell apart without warning, said Hidrobo, who lost his job at a food packing plant when it shut down and whose small business as an event videographer was decimated by canceled celebrations. After losing all of his sources of income, COVID made Hidrobo very sick in early 2020. He was uninsured and had no money for treatments. As he tried to recover, his landlord also evicted him from his Queens apartment because of missed rent payments. The worst part was that when I was starting to feel a little bit better physically, a call came in letting me know that my brother had died of COVID. I first came to New York because of him. He was my only family here. I didn't even get to say goodbye, he recounted. And so lastly, if we could move over one slide, we have Ana Ramirez, a 42-year-old migrant from Mexico who had been working in restaurants since she first arrived in New York City in 2009. Ramirez clearly remembered the moment she lost her job in 2020 when New York restaurants closed in mid-March. After the waitress and barista emptied her locker and said goodbye to her coworkers, she was unemployed for several months and ate up all her savings. Your heart starts beating really fast, and all you think about is having your boss call you back into work, said Ramirez. What I remember the most was the fear of getting COVID on top of everything else, knowing that I didn't have health insurance and my family wasn't around to help. I was terrified. Ana said that she knew she would participate in the hunger strike until its very end after her first week fasting. And here we can see her taking her first bite after 23 days. I knew I had to keep fighting as far as my body would go, she said. This money is not just money. It's a recognition of people like me who break a sweat, who take extra shifts, who work hard every day. It's a recognition of our dignity. We could move over to the next slide. Just to wrap up a little bit, as the fund became a sticking point in final budget negotiations during the first week of April, Correa, Hidrobo, and Ramirez, among other strikers, led a protest outside former Governor Andrew Cuomo's office. And in what was a flower-adorned rally that included Catholic communion to mark Easter Sunday, workers were dressed in white sheets and flower crowns and carried their job instruments with them, such as hard hats, mops, brooms, as well as signs that read, "Our labor saved lives and hungry for justice." So on April 7, 2021, if we could move over to our next slide, migrant strikers finally broke their fast during a public ceremony celebrating the fund's passage. And so after 23 days without food, there were significant health effects faced by some strikers. Correa, Hidrobo, and Ramirez all ended up in wheelchairs, unable to stand for too long. Hidrobo developed a severe eye infection while Ramirez battled an ulcer, and Correa's pressure, because Correa had high blood pressure, spiked continuously and dark circles emerged under her eyes. Hunger kept me up at night, she recounted. And so the state, New York State, began accepting applications for the Excluded Workers Fund's retroactive payments on August 1st. And so it received an average of 3,000 applications a day that month alone. But the fund then ran out in October 2021 with over 95,000 applications still pending. So at the start of 2022, undocumented workers demanded $3 additional billion for the Excluded Workers Fund, as well as the creation of a permanent undocumented employment insurance program. Just a few weeks ago, in fact, hundreds of migrant workers were marching over the Brooklyn and Manhattan bridges in protest of those left out of aid. But despite their campaign, Governor Kathy Hochul's first budget did not replenish the fund. If we could move over to our last slide. This is Merced Aguilar, a 43-year-old house cleaner from Mexico, who indeed received the top $15,600 payment after months and months of unemployment. I got the money, I can breathe again, she said. But so many house cleaners didn't. So many of my friends are still struggling. Okay, so this is all I have for you. I'd like to leave it here so we have some time for questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Marta, for that amazing presentation. Before I jump in with some questions, I just wanted to remind everybody about the Q&A chat in the bottom of the screen. So now's the time to go ahead and put your questions in there so you can join this conversation. But just to start off, I'm really interested in local organizing strategies and tactics. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how these organizations kind of popped up and started forming these coalitions to begin with, and then how they drew in public attention.
Absolutely. So when it comes to the Libreristas Unidos, I think the situation is a little bit different because you only had one dominating organization, which grew, in fact, as the Libreristas Unidos grew, which was Workers' Justice Project. But when it comes to the coalition, which was essentially 200 organizations sort of joining in together, you had organizations that were focusing very narrowly on different subset of workers. So you had organizations that were focusing on street vendors, for example. And so you had migrant street vendors joining these protests. You had organizations that were focused on female labor specifically. And so I think that part of the incentive for these organizations to say, you know, it's not just going to be one single community organization saying, hey, look at us, we have not received any aid. I think that early on, a sense of hundreds of organizations lobbying for the exact same thing was going to have much more of an impact, but most importantly, was going to bring in more workers. And so you had workers who, because this was local politics and because these are undocumented workers who trusted a single organization, but perhaps did not know another. And so you had people say, okay, I trust my organization. They're telling me that this is something that can happen. And so I'm going to join in this fast because I have trusted local leaders here that are telling me that this is okay, right? And so this is not to say that this was the case every time, but having local organizations that people trusted was a very big part, I think, of having workers be actually involved with this. And I think that honestly, there was also an element of it building up. You had organizations that were joining in as the protest was sort of gathering more support. And I think that in a place like New York City, you had something that was very useful, which was the city streets, right? And so you could just, the hunger strike was mainly took place in Washington Square Park, which is a very public place. Different kinds of people are just gonna walk up on and to say, oh, this is great, right? And to be perfectly honest, that was part of how I discovered these groups of workers. Just walking through Washington Square Park, you could see them clearly protesting over something. And so I think that very public demonstrations, shutting down bridges, shutting down parts of New York and saying, hey, we're here and we're being very loud and there's colors and people are chanting, made it really easy for people to see that something was brewing, even if they didn't know exactly what.
Yeah, so the outreach then, was it mostly done at an organizational level, or what was the role of social media in the growing of these organizations? I mean, I know we've seen the role of social media in labor organizations, and then also obviously the mobilizations of 2020, of March 2020. So did social media play a role here as well?
Yeah, I'd say that it was very interesting to see, I think, two cases. So with the Libreristas Unidos, you had a lot of sort of live streams on Facebook, which delivery workers were very active on, but also sort of allowed people to see bikers sort of driving, bikers doing certain activities. And so I think Facebook was very big for the Libreristas Unidos. That later moved a little bit to Twitter. You had some the Libreristas who remain to this day very active on Twitter, but I think it was to a lesser extent. And so there wasn't that much coordination when it came to the Libreristas Unidos. It sort of started to grow a little bit more organically because workers were trying to join in the group. And then, later journalists like me, community organizers were also, what's on that Facebook page. But when it came to the coalition, that was a much more structured effort. And you had digital media coordinators, you had people who were exclusively uploading content to social media. And so you had Instagram, you had Twitter, you had Facebook. And one of the most interesting elements to me was because I was camped out during the hunger strike for days in a row, migrants were very open to doing videos that felt really comfortable for them. And they knew that they could speak in Spanish and you could put subtitles in. And so you had a lot of willingness also from workers to participate in social media through videos, through talking to people, and, saying things like, I know that there's a big political debate, but I'm going to tell you my story, right? And so it was a very sort of personalized campaign when it came to the coalition. And you had so many people who were participating that you could actually pick and choose different stories and different videos. I don't know if that answers the question, but.
No, yeah, definitely. I wanted to ask about your take on why you think that these mobilizations were successful in this period of time. And obviously we know that labor organizing has really skyrocketed with the COVID-19 pandemic due to increased risk and feelings of invisibility, and also these hypocritical statements of the government in naming groups essential, but then not providing any rights. Or in your article, there was someone said essential basically ended up meaning sacrificial. And that hit me hard because I feel like that is definitely true. So we know that this dynamic was going on, but why else do you think that it was so successful at this point?
Right. So I think that with the coalition, you can see sort of play by play how it was very successful in 2020 and 2021, and how once workers were asking to replenish the fund, enough people didn't get the money, we need a permanent undocumented workers fund, the emphasis was just drawn out completely and there was no more steam powering it. And I think that was really telling of just how extreme the COVID crisis was for these communities and how hard it was for the larger public to ignore these campaigns when we had an entire rhetoric of helping essential workers, of being really empathetic, of really compensating people for the essential work that they did. And so I think that the fact that these campaigns really were on the ground in 2020 really made all the difference for people to support them, in the sense of it was really fresh in people's minds that because someone was bringing in their food when they were sick with COVID, they were able to sort of eat for that week, right? Or you had, people know, oh, I fired this certain houseworker when the pandemic started, and I have no idea what has happened to that person. So I think that, and this may sound hopefully not too cynic, but it was a little bit fresher in everyone's minds, and it felt more tangible for people to see how undocumented communities were struggling and migrant communities at large. And I think that both movements also did a very good job with connecting everything back to the pandemic, to what was happening, to overall human empathy. And I think that really worked well when it came to making them mainstream campaigns. But yeah, I would say the proximity to the pandemic and the emergency as it was, and as we perceived it generally, especially in cities like New York, who were, hardest hit, I think that really made a difference. And I think that we can see that sadly now with the Excluded Workers Fund not being replenished despite the need.
Can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Here a bit. I've been listening to this, and the one thing I know, because I've read several of your pieces about, that I'd like to just ask you to reflect a little bit, because the obviously the time of COVID both focused difficulties, but perhaps possibilities of resistance too. Um, but the deliveristas are, if I'm remembering correctly, overwhelmingly male.
Yes,
House cleaners, overwhelmingly women.
yes,
In addition, they sort of have a different set of employment relations, right? The deliverista works in one way for an app or two, but another way for everybody, right? At the same time. Whereas the house cleaners, mostly women, work for one or two or three families. And I just love to hear you reflect on how that impacted the different challenges they faced and the different abilities to address these things and get some resolution.
absolutely. And yeah, it was really fascinating for me to be so in touch with two movements. One of them was predominantly female and the other one was predominantly male. And you saw different gender norms and gender negotiations sort of play themselves out. And so I'd say that with the Liberistas, there was certainly a discourse that really helped the Liberistas tell people, you know, we're serving you, we're serving consumers, we're serving restaurants, right? But you also had a predominantly male labor force that never in a million years considered not working, right? You had a lot of wage earners, you had a lot of family heads that were just never within a place in which they could consider not working. And that's not to say that women workers stop working altogether, but some house cleaners that I encountered survived through the pandemic because of a male wage earner that did not stop working. And so you had stories of house cleaners, for example, who said, you know, had my husband not kept on working on delivery work, for example, we had those exact connections. I don't know what would have happened to us, right? But when it came to female labor, I think that it was very telling that most strikers, which I mean, you're thinking about over 3 weeks without food, you're thinking about workers with real incentives to protest, right? And you had a lot of women who were, you know, overpopulating cleaning industries, housework industries, a lot of health workers who essentially said, not only did I lose my job, but once I came back, I got sick with COVID because these were all negotiations happening within individual households, right? And it was a very private sphere, and there was even less regulation. And so you also had the worst of both worlds in the sense of, you know, I came back to work for this family, but I immediately got COVID because this family knew that they were infected, but I still had to clean up their house, right? And so I think that it was different predations and different expectations when it came to gender norms. But ultimately, and this is not to generalize, but I did see women falling through the cracks even more because of the industries that they were populating. And you had a lot of domestic workers, you had a lot of street vendors who lived in intense informality and who were among the first to fall through the cracks. But that is not to say that the pressure of male wage earners was not real. And, you know, there was still not enough demand for construction workers, delivery workers, restaurant workers. But I did see women struggle more in that sense.
A little follow-up. So it was clear in your presentation that the apps took a role in trying to use this as a moment of control, of pressure, of limit. They were not promoting their workers' welfare. I will say that. You have, but they're easy to identify. There are a limited number of folks who act publicly in ways you can see what they're doing, right? And they're employed. Do you have any sense of the variety of approaches of those who employed? I mean, yes, cases like the one you just did took advantage, right, of a worker. Any cases of any of the families or others who employed them trying to support them in their movement, or anything else, or were they just an absence in the movement?
Sorry, so do you mean for delivery workers or for?
I'm thinking for house cleaners.
Okay.
And for house cleaners, because many of them have had an ongoing relationship with the family or 2 or 3, depending upon the relationship for an ongoing period of time. And I'm just wondering if you have any sense of how those who, and clearly sort of that first, I don't want to call it knee jerk. The problem is exposure. We have to have this worker out of the house because it increases exposure. There's sort of an easy explanation for why people were let go.
Absolutely.
But as families start to feel the need and some to have the help, some families may feel some guilt. Some families may feel some social responsibility. There's an array of possible. I'm just wondering if I don't know if you ever spoke to any of the people who employed them, or if any of the women you spoke to talked about how the families that employed them viewed their attempts to organize. I go to it, or please don't, or we'll block you at every stop. I don't know. I'd be intrigued to learn of that.
I think that a very good example for that sort of dual possibility of we're either going to support you all the way, both financially and as you organize and as you protest, and we don't want anything to do with this, was very evident when applications to the Excluded Workers Fund were finalized. And so essentially, people who were working as house cleaners, who had no contract, who were working for an individual family, often had to provide as evidence of their unemployment a letter signed by their employers, right? And so community organizations were very good at, we'll help you draft the letter in English, but your employer does have to sign this, right? And so we saw it go both ways. And I spoke to a lot of house cleaners who did not make it into the fund because their employers were slow to sign that, did not want to sign it, did not want to have any sort of binding document, you are working for me. I know that you're undocumented and I just don't want to have any part of this. And so you had this in industries that were much more sort of high turnover industries, right? You had this phenomenon with house cleaners who were essentially doing day labor, especially in Brooklyn, and who were working for different families day in and day out. And so for those people, it was really not a possibility to have, employers be really mindful of who they were at times or being able to support those efforts. But you also had, but I would make the caveat of saying that these were the lucky few who had been working for a family for a really long time. We had a lot of healthcare workers and health aides who had been working with, the same people for 13 years or so. And so in those cases, you did see employers being really supportive, providing that documentation, offering, some of them in fact offered for these workers to live at home with them. And so it was a little bit of a trade-off, but you can essentially come live in the guest room and then you can stay throughout the pandemic and keep working for me without sort of risking more exposure, right? And so I'd say that the majority, unfortunately, when it comes to the people that I interviewed, was, please don't, we do not want a lot to do with this. We understand that you've struggled, but we really don't have much of a stake in this. And then a lucky few women who were very close to their employers did get that support. But I'd say that it was sadly more of an exception than the norm.
Would you draw a conclusion that that was a piece of the weakening of their movement and probably inhibits it going forward?
Absolutely.
I guess that's the last thing I'm sort of thinking about. So we're all once more dreaming that the worst of it is over. I don't know how any other way to say it, but should this be the time the dream more or less comes true and life more or less returns toward, I'm not going to call it normal, what it was before. I mean, ironically, you describe what the way bike messengers and house cleaners live. That should not be normal ever. But should we return to what was on before? What do you think? In other words, do you think either or both can hold on to the organizational strength and keep getting benefits? And what are your suspicions? Because all you can do is wonder.
Yeah, no, of course. And I mean, I like to speculate, but I really have no clue as to where these two movements will go. But I think that when it comes to the Libreristas Unidos, it really, For example, a few days ago, as I mentioned in my presentation, there was sort of a layered enactment of these laws that they won. And so last week, one of these laws became sort of official New York City law. And you had Senator Chuck Schumer come down, you had Representative Ocasio-Cortez not come down, but be very supportive through social media. And so I think that now that gig work is taking over sort of a national debate, because so many tech industries are employing this model, and so many tech industries are very loudly promoting that this should be the model. We should never think about these people as employees, even if they work full time, even if they're low wage couriers who are fully dependent on this work, right? And so I think that the California New York debate is really interesting for the future of the Libreristas Unidos, because it really has become a point of comparison. You know, this happened in California, gig companies got away with this, you know, massive deal of never having to think about reclassifying their employees. And in New York, you have one of the most important cities in the US sort of battling these conditions at the local level, right? It's not a small locality to say that you're regulated in New York City. And so I think that when it comes to the Libreristas Unidos, I have seen a little bit more of that sustained effort to say, this is not just a conversation about these 6 laws, this is a conversation about, you know, we're not going anywhere. People may be ordering in a little bit less compared to the pandemic, but these are companies that are here to stay and that people, and especially younger people, are very much familiar with. And urban spaces and suburban spaces are slightly addicted to delivery apps and the comfort that they provide, right? So I think that there is an opportunity to talk about this sort of as a national conversation. And I think that the Libreristas Unidos has taken that opportunity to do that. And they constantly refer to themselves as, you know, the first workers who did this, more people could follow our example. But when it comes to the Excluded Workers Coalition, I think that because of the amount of money that was spent on these communities, there is a little bit more of a sense of let's pat ourselves on the back as legislators, as New Yorkers, as the general public, we help them out. But as you said, things are back to normal, right? And so we can all just keep going as we were going. And so I have seen a little bit less steam in that sense, but it's also a movement that drew from so many organizations that I do wonder how each of them are going to reframe the conversation. So that's as far as my speculation goes.
Right.
On this topic of reframing debates, I'm wondering about how you see the definition of labor changing in the US, especially with this rupture that the pandemic has caused. It kind of creates a reforming of our consciousness and understanding of different values within society. So yeah, how do you see the definition of labor changing, especially with this contrast between like who's represented by the National Labor Standards Act, right? And who's considered independent contractor or gig worker, which they purposely put in the title. Do you see that as something that's going to move in a different direction now? What do you think?
I do think that because of the growth of gig work and because of the predominant models of low wage workers being classified as gig workers, and then at the same time, it being a known reality that gig companies are fully supported by racialized workforces, I think that the opportunity to think about, wait, why are these people gig workers? Why are they not employees? Is a conversation that is happening. But unfortunately, I do think that when people think about delivery apps and when people think about companies like Uber or DoorDash, it becomes evident really quickly that these are mega funded companies. They're now public companies. And so now their success really benefits large sectors of the population and large corporations and large venture capitalists who are very much interested in seeing them succeed. And so I remember that I had a conversation early on with an economist from Columbia who said, you know, it's simple math. You take out the gig work, you take out the independent contractors, and the model just collapses. It's not going to hold on. And so there's definitely, I think, a lot riding on gig companies promoting and cementing that gig work status. And I think that because of certain sound bites that have become very much associated with gig work, which is, you see DoorDash or Uber Eats promotions, and you see sort of college kids riding their bike, and it's just all so fun, and they're doing it, part-time to just earn a little extra cash, like I mentioned. And so I think that that kind of language has really become prevalent. And I think that a lot of us, and I include myself in this, before looking at what was happening on the ground, I really did think that gig work was, this wonderful option of flexible labor that didn't really entail a lot of effort. And that's not to say that that's not the case for some people, but you see large workforces, especially in urban areas that are racialized workforces, migrant workforces, that just have a different reality, right? So I unfortunately don't know how much of a conscience we have about that, about, gig work being labor sort of benefiting certain corporations. But I also think that more and more people are being very open about, this is a work I do day in and day out. And because you're classifying me as such, you might not look at me a certain way, but I'm very much a worker, very much an employee. And I'd love to know that if I crash my bike, my family is going to have some compensation. I'd love to know that I can have health insurance. But I do think that the conversation around flexibility has really given the upper hand to these corporations and saying, we're just advocating for flexibility. This is nothing, nothing nefarious is going on. We really just want to give people the opportunity to work whenever they want and however they want. And you see the incentives that I just showed you, how that's not even the reality, but I think that the rhetoric around it is very strong. And sadly, I don't see a lot of interest yet. I met, I think, all of the gig work experts that I was to meet, and it was way too few experts still. So that's a little bit of an optimistic and also negative prediction. Sorry about the phone.
No worries at all. Yeah, I have a comment on that. I remember right when Uber kind of started, like 10 years ago now, or maybe more, but I remember having these conversations with my family and friends about how it was like really going to be a problem for union mobilizations because it's displacing unionized workers and making it into gig work, which was, it was previously a full-time job, but pretends that it isn't, but still is, right? So it's interesting to kind of see it go full circle, and I'm excited about, I feel like I have a different perception to what you have, because I'm excited about the direction it can go, especially with like the conditions that are currently happening in the nation, with a lot of retail workers unionizing, obviously. And then last week, Etsy, which is kind of similar to these platforms, just announced that they were going to form a union. So I wonder if that will, like be part of the spark that kind of pushes this movement into the like app and gig workspace. But with these specific mobilizations that you were presenting on, it's interesting how it's a unique opportunity for migrant rights and labor rights to come together. So I was wondering if you could, talk a little bit about that and where you see the movement converging in the future.
Absolutely. And I mean, just to be a little bit more of an optimist, I do think that more and more people are very loudly saying, this is labor that needs the compensation of employees. But like I said, the pushback from very well-funded corporations does make me a little bit more skeptical. But so, yeah, when it comes to sort of human rights, migrant rights, and labor rights, I think that both the Libreristas Unidos and the Excluded Workers Coalition inadvertently, in many ways, talked about human rights constantly. And they talked about inhumane conditions, and they talked about this cannot be happening, in New York City in the 21st century. So I think that there was that acknowledgement of this is not only a conversation about labor regulation or about fair models of compensation. This is also a conversation about how we as a society view certain workers and how we think we're entitled to treat them, right? And so I think that especially with the Libreristas Unidos, there was a lot of conscience about, let's talk about, this is just not right. This should not be happening. They are violating our human rights. And there was definitely not shying away from that. which I thought was absolutely great and really hit points that were, the bathroom conversation with the Libertad Estados Unidos was really big. When you think about how a group of workers had to push a local legislature to codify something as basic as someone within a restaurant saying, you know what, you can come in, use the bathroom, you're wearing a mask, we're all fine. This is not going to give COVID to everyone, right? And so I think that a lot of the conversations around they're not letting us use our restrooms, the restaurant restrooms, had a lot to do with views that we have about migrant workers and whether they do deserve those basic human rights. And I think that when it comes to the coalition, there was also a little bit of that rhetoric of, it's not fair for us to experience these things beyond certain labor regimes because we're not really seen as people. And so we had a lot of house workers, house cleaners, and domestic workers say things like, you're a worker first, a person second, and because there's no system regulating anything regarding your labor, you become this sort of sub person who is not really worthy of basic considerations such as a glass of water when you're cleaning a kitchen, right? And so I think that those sort of hyperboles in a way of migrants saying, we're treated as such because we look a certain way, because we speak Spanish predominantly, because we speak an indigenous dialect predominantly. And so those sort of reckonings with discrimination really did touch a lot upon this is not only a labor issue, but how we're perceived by a lot of people and what they think that they can get away with. So I do think that there is a little bit more space in these kinds of movements to talk about human rights in a way that really, in a lot of these campaigns, all you had to do was look at the evidence that they were providing, and it became clear whether you were, a lawyer or not, that these were violations of some kind that transcended sort of a labor regulation issue. So I think that they were really good about sort of that conversation, but it also, the kind of work that they did really was something that they were able to take advantage of in terms of campaigns.
Yeah, and on top of just like something, or rights that transcended a labor issue is also rights that transcended national boundaries, right? I think that it was really significant that in the protests, people were carrying flags of their home nation and not the United States, and like making that claim to belonging with the flag of where they were born. I thought that was really significant. Actually, a question just came in. So let me go ahead and read that one. So this is from Lily Lopate, and she said, "Hi, Martha, it's Lily from J School. I'm curious to know how you first came to discover this topic. And once you did, how did you carve a niche for yourself in it to extract so much precise reporting and research that would continue from 2020 to now? And how have you handled the material for reporting versus academic research?"
It's a tough question. What I will say, and I think that a lot of the people who were with me during J School will remember this, is how obsessed I became with delivery apps and delivery workers without really ever meaning to be this obsessed. And so I just started, I think for me, it really began as something as simple as just watching a lot of people speak Spanish, and me being a native Spanish speaker, sort of listen to those people and say, I wonder what those people are doing. And it just sort of very organically evolved. And the journalism program that I was attending to really allowed me to sort of run free with this idea of, what is this industry? Who are these people? Where do they come from? And I think that freedom, as well as having mentors who were Latinx and who had a little bit more awareness of, oh yes, this is an industry that is highly populated by migrants, really helped in me just sort of running wild with this idea and just sort of seeing where it would take me. And I was very fortunate in meeting people that, I thought I was just meeting, interviewing them once for a piece, and then really accompanying them through all of the different changes that their movements underwent. And I think that by the time that I sort of arrived at the Excluded Workers Coalition, I'd been talking to migrant workers enough across the Libertad Estados Unidos that it became a little bit easier for me, here are ways to spotlight these people, being a Spanish speaker really helped in that regard. Here are ways to sort of not be a player, but sort of, I sort of introduced myself as a journalist, but ultimately I think my interest became more academic as I went along. And so talking about sort of future plans of embarking on a history PhD, I think that the academic interest sort of won a little bit just because of limitations that you had as a journalist. You had to, not be too detailed about certain things. And it was all about, just tell me what the story is. And all I kept thinking was, the story is really complex and we really have to look at it from different sides. And journalism really didn't award me that opportunity that much. And so I think that what became a little bit of, this is what I want to do, also allowed me to realize I want to do this from an academic perspective. And so I think you can see some mixtures there in my work of, is she a journalist or is she trying to be an academic about it? There's definitely a mixture there.
As a long observer of this process, I'm going to add a note to this, but based on something you said, because what I want to really underline is you went out and first engaged these people and really helped be a native Spanish speaker, right? And at the first meeting, they were a source, a journalist source,
Yes.
but they very quickly became people. And as people, they bridged the gap between journalism and a broader, and I would just say, sort of just a broader social context. And to me, part of the key of what you did is that it quickly was clear to you that you were following people's lives. They weren't just your sources. And to me, whether people do this from similar things from a perspective, whether you call it journalism or oral history, contemporary history, or the like, it's an absolutely critical direction to keep. In other words, you have to see the life, the person in the long haul. And I will just say you did quite a good job of that in all of this. I actually, we're kind of getting a little bit low on time, but I loved your earlier emphasis about how effectively the public media campaigns on the importance of flexibility. And boy, everybody, and I must say, boy, is that persuasive. If you're middle class, if you're a college student looking to get right their career going, flexibility is a good thing. You want it. And at a certain level of skill, right, and technical skill, flexibility is just wonderful, maybe even stimulating. But I've often thought it euphemizes its own other side, which is insecurity. That the business, the employer says, so this is wonderful flexibility. And first and foremost, it's flexibility for the employer. But for the employee, unless they have unique skills, that flexibility is just structural insecurity. And what it reminds me of, I had this conversation years ago with the great historian of industrialization and more, Eric Weitz, in which he kept running about efficiency. And people defending classic industrialization said, it's efficient. Well, efficient meant producing more goods with fewer workers for less pay. And it's efficient. And of course, who's against efficiency? Who's against flexibility? So I just wanted to highlight that because that point, it's just a wonderful, to me, advice that says, watch the euphemisms, think about them, understand what's underlying them here. So, anything else from you, Marcela?
No, I think that's everything. Thank you so much, Martha. It was such a nice conversation. I loved getting to speak with you.
I hope we didn't ramble too much.
I will sort of hop back in again and thank Marta for a wonderful presentation. And I think I can undoubtedly say the best photos of the whole series. And all those who took those photos, hopefully you will share. They're just wonderfully revealing. Thank you, Marcela. And I want to sort of at this point emphasize to the larger audience that while Marcela is the scholar who is so deep into these conversations. She has also operated as a graduate assistant, getting this whole series together with me. So she deserves thanks beyond that. I want to thank Carolina Marin, who is here in the background, and she has been organizing and keeping us together and straightening us out for 8 series, and we couldn't have done it with Carolina, so I want to emphasize to her. And I want to also thank Alejandro Werner, who came on as the new director of the Americas Institute after, in fact, we had this underway, though we had chatted with him, he knew this was coming. And his support for all of this has been really important to us. So I want to thank everybody. Thank you for the series, and say this is the last public event the Americas Forum will do this year, though the Institute will have more to come. But next fall, look for good things. And thank you all very much.